By the middle of World War II, in the spring of 1943, the Atlantic Ocean had become the stage for an invisible war. Beneath its surface, battles unfolded that no eye could see, though the sounds echoed in the sonar equipment of ships above. German U-boats, called wolf packs, hunted Allied convoys, cutting the vital lifelines between North America and Europe. Each day, ships sank, lives were lost, and no route was safe. Germany, exhausted on the Eastern Front, still clung to faith in a miracle, in a new weapon that could change the course of the war. At the moment when the Reich began to recognize the limits of its power, projects were taking shape in secret laboratories and staff offices, known only to a handful of men. Among them was one involving atomic energy, an area where science touched the edge of the abyss. Germany sought a way to outpace its enemies and to pass its technology to its eastern ally, Japan. This idea became part of a desperate strategy, born in the final years of the war, when hope had lost its shape, but the instinct to survive still drove action. In Kiel, within the quiet dockyards of the Germania-Werft shipyard, a new submarine of the type IXC-40 was under preparation. Its number was U-234. It stood out for its size and range. Unlike combat submarines, this vessel was designed not for hunting, but for long-distance transport. On paper, its mission was described as Special Technical Delivery. In truth, it was one of the most secret operations in the entire history of the German Navy. Command of the submarine was first given to Captain Lieutenant Johann Heinrich Faulhaber, later replaced by the more experienced Johann Heinrich Fehler, a seasoned officer with dozens of patrols behind him. His task was to take the submarine across the Atlantic, evade Allied patrols, and deliver its cargo to the Japanese port of Sasebo. The cargo of U-234 was so valuable that even most of the crew were unaware of its contents. Official documents listed radar components, aircraft blueprints, optical systems, and other advanced equipment. Later, it would become known that among the sealed containers in the hold were 563 kilograms of uranium oxide packed inside lead cylinders. The true purpose of the material was unknown even to those assigned to guard it. On 12 April 1943, preparations began for the mission. For months, the submarine remained at the dock while engineers installed additional systems and reinforced ballast tanks. Workers in gray overalls moved crates under the watch of SS officers. The papers accompanying the shipment were marked Geheimreichssache State Secret. Only a few staff officers of the Kriegsmarine knew the real objective: to deliver to Japan materials that could assist in the creation of an atomic weapon. By late 1944, Germany was rapidly losing ground on all fronts. The Allies had landed in France, Soviet troops were on the Vistula, and defeat seemed inevitable. Yet ties with Japan persisted. The Japanese Navy still believed Germany could provide technologies capable of changing the balance of the war in the Pacific. Thus, the plan emerged to send a submarine capable of crossing the oceans undetected, carrying scientific cargo to Japan. The winter of 1944-1945 became a time of darkness. Cities of the Ruhr lay in ruins, Allied bombers ruled the skies, and the shipyards worked in desperation. Among the engineers and officers, there was a mixture of hopelessness and fanatical faith, a belief that science might still bring salvation. The submarine U-234, standing silently at the pier, became a symbol of that belief, the last secret of the Third Reich, preparing to vanish into the ocean depths. By the spring of 1945, as Germany stood on the brink of surrender, the mission was ready. On board were not only German officers, but also 2 Japanese naval engineers and several Luftwaffe specialists. Their duty was to accompany the cargo and deliver the technical instructions to their counterparts in Japan. Thus began the story of a submarine the world would learn about only after the war, a story where science, secrecy, and despair intertwined. U-234 would become more than a vessel. It would become a symbol of humanity's final attempt to master a force powerful enough to alter history itself. By the beginning of 1945, Germany's military machine was collapsing. The Reich was losing territory, its armies were retreating, and its cities lay in ashes. Yet in the shadows of this ruin, in naval headquarters and underground laboratories, work still continued on what many saw as the last possible chance. Admirals and engineers believed that the alliance with Japan could still serve a purpose if Germany managed to transfer advanced technologies that the Allies did not yet possess. Thus, the final order was given. The submarine U-234 was to begin her voyage eastward, across the oceans, carrying a cargo that could never fall into enemy hands. Preparations for the mission were conducted under strict secrecy. Ordinary sailors knew nothing of its purpose, and even the officers were told only what their specific duties required. At the Kiel shipyard, U-234 was fitted with extra fuel tanks, long-range navigation equipment, and air purification systems capable of sustaining months underwater. Every space within her hull was used to the limit. Between fuel reservoirs and batteries, metal cylinders were carefully secured, each marked U-235. The irony of the designation went unspoken. Nearly 50 tons of equipment were loaded aboard. The cargo included blueprints for the Messerschmitt Me 262 jet aircraft, radar components, high-frequency vacuum tubes, and samples of rare alloys. In one sealed compartment, engineers placed heavy lead-lined containers. The shipping documents described them as materials for scientific experiments. In reality, they held canisters filled with uranium oxide, refined at secret facilities in Germany and Czechoslovakia. In addition to the crew, several civilians were assigned to the voyage. Among them was General Ulrich Kessler of the Luftwaffe, tasked with delivering aviation technologies to Japan, and two Japanese naval officers, Hideo Tominaga and Genzo Shoji. They had come to Germany in 1944 to study at the Junkers and Messerschmitt factories, and were now to accompany the submarine to Japanese waters, ensuring safe delivery of the precious cargo. On 20 March 1945, U-234 received final orders to prepare for departure. Captain Johann Heinrich Fehler conducted a full inspection, sealed the holds, and accepted sealed documents signed by the Naval High Command. The encrypted message read, "Proceed according to Plan East. If intercepted, destroy the cargo. If continuation of mission becomes impossible, head south and seek Japanese bases." Unknown to the crew, Allied forces already dominated the Atlantic, turning the ocean into a deadly trap. U-234 left Kiel in early April 1945. The sky was gray, the air cold. There were no ceremonies, no music, only the bark of commands and the creak of chains. Slowly, the submarine slipped away from the pier, submerged, and headed north toward Norway, where the Kriegsmarine's last bases remained. In Bergen, the crew refueled and received final instructions. News from the front was dire. Berlin was near encirclement. The Americans were at the Rhine, and Soviet armies prepared to storm the capital. Still, the order stood. On 10 April 1945, U-234 entered open sea. Her route stretched across the North Atlantic, then southward past the Azores, and on toward the equator, eventually to cross into the Indian Ocean. The estimated voyage would take 3 months. The crew maintained strict silence. Radios remained off. Antennas were retracted. Navigation relied on stars and magnetic readings. The submarine cruised at 60 meters depth, conserving fuel and avoiding Allied patrols. Inside, the only sounds were the pulse of diesel engines and the groan of pressure on steel. Each man aboard knew that the world they had left behind was collapsing. Reports intercepted before departure spoke of Berlin under siege and of command centers falling silent. Yet duty was absolute. deliver the cargo, regardless of what became of the Reich itself. In those dark waters, the mission of U-234 became more than a military operation. It became a symbol of desperate faith, the belief that even as nations died, knowledge could still preserve their legacy. None aboard knew that within weeks, the world around them would change forever. They carried in their hold a substance that would soon define a new age, the atomic age. By mid-April 1945, Germany had ceased to exist as a functioning state. City after city was reduced to rubble, the army was losing cohesion, and the naval command received orders that no longer matched reality. A sense of finality hung in the air, yet within the headquarters of the Kriegsmarine, a semblance of discipline remained. Submarines were still being sent to sea, though the chances of return were nearly zero. Among them was U-234, continuing her eastward voyage, unaware that the nation she served was already crumbling. On the surface, the Atlantic belonged to the Allies. Long-range patrol aircraft swept vast areas, and advanced sonar systems detected submarines from miles away. U-234 moved cautiously, diving deep whenever a propeller sound echoed through the hydrophones. Captain Johann Heinrich Fehler understood that his vessel was no longer merely a ship, it was a time capsule, carrying the last remnants of German science and secrecy into the depths. Inside the submarine, silence and unease prevailed. The crew knew that the home front was collapsing. From the final coded briefings received before departure, they had learned that on 16 April 1945, Soviet forces had begun their assault on Berlin. Radio transmissions were forbidden, yet rumors still found their way into the narrow steel corridors. The men understood that they might already belong to history. As U-234 crept through the dark waters, Germany's navy was dissolving above them. Bases in Norway were being evacuated. Admirals were burning archives, and ships unable to sail were being scuttled at their piers. Negotiations for surrender had begun, but the undersea war continued by inertia. Orders remained orders. By 27 April 1945, when U-234 had passed the central Atlantic and was heading south, the Battle of Berlin raged at its peak. In the Führerbunker, Hitler issued commands to imaginary divisions and demanded naval operations that were impossible to execute. Within days, Soviet troops encircled the city completely. Communication with Berlin was collapsing. The state itself was disintegrating hour by hour. On 1 May 1945, news of Hitler's death reached the remnants of the German Navy. For those still at sea, the message confirmed what they already suspected. Captain Fehler had no official confirmation, but the truth was evident. The Reich had fallen, yet no one aboard knew what that meant for them. The Atlantic was now a silent witness to the end of an empire. Hundreds of U-boats were still underway, each carrying its own secret, its own crew, and its own uncertain fate. Some surrendered to Allied fleets. Others scuttled themselves to avoid capture. But U-234 continued on, guided by orders that had lost their purpose but still retained their power. Fehler realized that there was no way back. Returning to Germany meant sailing toward captivity or destruction, and continuing to Japan meant a journey through seas controlled entirely by the enemy. Still, in the sealed compartments of his submarine lay a cargo whose importance transcended any personal destiny. He chose to continue, obeying the last standing order to proceed until instructed otherwise. Beneath the Atlantic, while Berlin burned above, U-234 pressed onward through the dark water, a steel ghost from a dying empire, carrying within it a substance that would soon change the meaning of power itself. In the first days of May 1945, the ocean was silent. Beneath its gray surface, U-234 continued her course southward, as though the world above still existed in its former shape. Inside, the crew maintained order, yet a tension filled the air, the kind that comes when men sense that something irreversible has occurred. No new signals came from home. The radio operators reported only static. The silence from Germany spoke louder than words. Captain Johann Heinrich Fehler knew what such silence meant. A total halt in communications was rarely a coincidence. It could only signify collapse. Yet he had no authority to act on assumptions. His orders remained clear: to complete the mission and deliver the cargo. But with each passing hour, that order lost meaning. On 4 May 1945, the stillness was broken. A faint coded transmission reached the submarine, an official message from Admiral Karl Donitz, who had assumed leadership of the remnants of the Reich after Hitler's death. The message read, "All naval combat operations are to cease immediately. All U-boats are to remain at their current positions and await further orders." Fehler studied the message carefully. It was unambiguous, yet incomplete. What was a submarine in the middle of the ocean to do? To stop was to drift toward oblivion. The crew gathered in the central compartment, listening as the order was read aloud. No one spoke, but every man understood. The war was over. From that moment on, any continuation of the mission would be an act without purpose. 2 days later, on 6 May 1945, another transmission arrived. This one carried the final directive: all German naval vessels are to surface, raise black flags, and surrender to the nearest Allied authority. With those few words, the Kriegsmarine ceased to exist. Fehler sat in his cabin for a long time. The documents in his safe, stamped with imperial seals and marked top secret, were now meaningless. Germany had surrendered. But the submarine under his command carried something far greater than its crew. In the sealed containers below deck lay a material of immense significance, a weapon, or at least the potential for one. To surrender it was to hand over the last scientific achievement of a defeated nation. He convened his senior officers. The discussion was calm, deliberate. They weighed two options: continue toward Japan, still technically an ally, or obey Donitz's order and surrender. Japan had not yet capitulated, but the seas ahead were controlled by the Allies. Reaching Asia was impossible. Rumors told of submarines destroyed en route, sunk before they could reach the Pacific. That night, U-234 surfaced briefly to receive updated signals. The new transmission confirmed Germany's unconditional surrender on 8 May 1945. There were no more commands to await. The state they served no longer existed. Fehler faced a choice no commander wanted: defy the order and risk annihilation, or surrender and preserve his men and their secret. After hours of thought, he chose obedience. He ordered a change of course toward the northwest, heading for the American coast. The nearest possible contact was with the U.S. Navy. The Japanese officers aboard reacted with silence. For them, surrender was unthinkable. On 10 May, they ended their lives in accordance with their code. Fehler recorded their deaths in the ship's log and buried them at sea with full military honors, a final act of dignity in a war that had lost all meaning. 2 days later, U-234 surfaced again in the northern Atlantic. She transmitted her position and a short message: German submarine, U-234, ready to surrender. It was the last signal she ever sent as a vessel of the Third Reich. The morning of 14 May 1945 was cold and foggy. The Atlantic lay vast and indifferent, unmoved by the fall of empires or the end of ideologies. Through the gray waves, a dark shape surfaced: the German submarine U-234. Her steel hull glistened with salt water, and above the conning tower fluttered a black flag, the symbol of surrender ordered by Admiral Donitz. A radio message had been sent hours earlier: German submarine U-234 ready to surrender, awaiting instructions. The signal was intercepted by Allied ships patrolling south of Newfoundland. The response came swiftly: the U.S. Navy instructed the submarine to remain surfaced, to cease all movement, and to await the arrival of American forces. Hours later, silhouettes appeared on the horizon, a group of American destroyers, among them the USS Sutton. The crew of U-234 assembled on deck in silence. Faces were drawn, expressions blank. After weeks in the deep, they now looked upon open sky and sunlight, but neither brought comfort. For these men, the voyage was over. The purpose that had guided them across the ocean had vanished. Standard procedures were followed. The destroyer signaled the order for the German commander to approach. Captain Johann Heinrich Fehler, carrying his identification papers and navigational documents, descended into a small boat with several officers. As they crossed the short distance to the American vessel, sailors on the Sutton stood by, weapons ready. Upon boarding, Fehler formally declared the surrender of U-234 and handed over the submarine's official documents. From that moment, the vessel and her crew were in American hands. U.S. sailors boarded the submarine to inspect it, documenting equipment, layout, and cargo. Initially, the Americans believed they had captured a transport of experimental parts, a valuable but ordinary prize of war. Then they reached the sealed containers in the lower hold. The manifest listed them simply as U-235 oxide, 563 kilograms. At first, the notation meant little. Only when scientists examined the contents did the truth emerge. The containers held uranium oxide material essential for the development of atomic weapons. The discovery immediately elevated U-234 from a military curiosity to a matter of national importance. The submarine was escorted to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where it arrived under heavy guard. The crew was detained, treated humanely, and provided with food and medical care. But the interrogations were relentless. Every officer was questioned about the cargo, its origin, and its destination. Fehler stated that he had received sealed orders and was unaware of the true nature of what he transported. The Americans, however, suspected otherwise. Aboard the submarine, tragedy had already struck. On 13 May, the two Japanese officers Hideo Tominaga and Genzo Shoji had taken their own lives rather than face capture. Their bodies were buried at sea, wrapped in the flags they had brought from their homeland. Fehler recorded the event in the ship's log. They died in accordance with their beliefs. It was the final entry written under the flag of the Reich. Upon arrival in Portsmouth, teams from the Office of Naval Intelligence and scientists from the Manhattan Project immediately secured the cargo. Every document, cylinder, and technical drawing was classified. The uranium was transported to an undisclosed facility for analysis. For the United States, the capture of U-234 was a stroke of fortune. Its cargo and documentation offered insights into German research, and perhaps accelerated developments already underway in America's own atomic program. For the crew, it was the end of a mission that had long outlived its purpose. U-234's voyage had begun as an act of desperation, a last secret hope of a dying regime. It ended as a quiet surrender in the middle of an indifferent sea, her cargo destined to shape the dawn of a terrifying new age. After U-234 arrived at Portsmouth Naval Yard in mid-May 1945, she was immediately placed under the strict control of U.S. naval intelligence. Captain Johann Heinrich Fehler and his senior officers were separated from the crew and transferred to secure interrogation facilities. American investigators treated the case with extraordinary caution. The documents found aboard indicated that the mission had been planned at the highest levels of the German command, involving not only the Navy, but also technical divisions tied to the Reich's scientific research. But the true focus of the investigation was the cargo. The lead-lined containers from the lower hold were carefully transported to a restricted naval site and opened under supervision. Inside were cylindrical canisters filled with a yellowish powder. Laboratory analysis confirmed what some already suspected it was: high-purity uranium oxide. Scientists brought in from the Manhattan Project verified that the material was suitable for use in nuclear research and possibly for bomb development. For the U.S. authorities, The discovery was of immense significance. By that time, the Manhattan Project was nearing completion, and any evidence that Germany had pursued its own atomic ambitions was of the highest strategic interest. The cargo of U-234 provided both proof and potential advantage. It revealed that Nazi scientists had come closer to understanding nuclear processes than many Allied experts had believed. In Portsmouth, a special commission was quickly assembled, including representatives from Naval Intelligence, the U.S. Army, and the Office of Scientific Research and Development. All materials, from blueprints to laboratory notes, were immediately classified as top secret. Even within the military, access was strictly limited. No mention of the uranium cargo was to appear in press releases or official naval communiques. American newspapers briefly reported the surrender of a large German U-boat carrying technical materials to Japan, but the true nature of its contents remained hidden. To the public, it was just another captured submarine. The details would stay buried for decades. Meanwhile, interrogations continued. Fehler described the voyage, the encrypted orders, and the chain of command. He insisted that he had never been told what the containers held. His duty had been transportation, not inquiry. His answers were calm, measured, and consistent, but investigators knew the secrecy surrounding the mission meant that few, if any, aboard truly understood its full scope. Scientists examined the accompanying documentation with equal scrutiny. Among the papers were blueprints of jet engines, radar schematics, and notes on high-energy materials. These fragments painted a clear picture. Even in its final months, Germany had been pursuing advanced weapons and scientific breakthroughs with relentless determination. The secrecy surrounding U-234 grew deeper. By late summer 1945, the submarine had been moved to a naval base for further study. Engineers inspected every system, measuring the vessel's range, propulsion, and internal design. Later, she was used for training purposes before being dismantled. The official records of her cargo were sealed and filed away under long-term classification. Some historians would later suggest that the uranium seized from U-234 may have found its way to Los Alamos, feeding into the final stages of the Manhattan Project. There is no conclusive proof, but the timing remains striking. The submarine reached American waters just 2 months before the Trinity test, the first detonation of an atomic bomb. From the moment of her surrender, U-234 vanished from public record. The case carried a 20-year secrecy restriction. Even Allied post-war reports barely mentioned it, referring only to a special German transport submarine, the U.S. Government was determined to prevent any speculation about its link to nuclear research or to the weapons that would soon reshape history. Thus, the submarine that had left Europe as the final hope of a dying empire became a silent witness to the birth of the nuclear age. In her steel compartments had lain not only technical cargo, but the symbol of a new world, one where destruction could be unleashed with the force of a single spark. After the war ended, the fate of U-234 and her mysterious cargo disappeared into obscurity. All documentation related to the operation was classified, and the participants were kept in isolation. American intelligence agencies and scientific departments tied to nuclear research worked quietly, ensuring that the public would never learn the details. In the fragile new balance of the post-war world, such knowledge could have provoked political tension and questions best left unasked. Captain Johann Heinrich Fehler and several of his senior officers were placed in prisoner-of-war camps. They were interrogated repeatedly by representatives of naval intelligence and by scientists linked to the U.S. Army. Most questions revolved around the cargo, where it came from, who had ordered the mission, and the identities of the Japanese passengers. Fehler's replies never changed. He had received sealed orders, knew little of the cargo's contents, and had simply executed his duty. The transcripts of those interrogations were later sealed, and many were eventually destroyed. Ordinary crew members of U-234 were repatriated in 1946. Returning to a shattered Germany, few of them realized the magnitude of their final mission. Only years later, When details of the Manhattan Project became public, did some begin to understand what they had carried? Most chose silence, unwilling to reopen the past. Within the scientific community, however, rumors persisted. Confidential reports circulated among laboratories, referring obliquely to materials of German origin. Analysts who studied the uranium from U-234 noted its high purity and suitability for enrichment experiments. Although official records offered no confirmation, the timing was undeniable. Just 2 months after the submarine's arrival, on 16 July 1945, the first atomic bomb was tested at Alamogordo. The submarine itself became an object of study for naval engineers. Her construction, fuel systems, and internal design were carefully examined to inform future American submarine development. By 1947, U-234 was dismantled and scrapped. Her hull melted down. On paper, she ceased to exist, yet her shadow lingered in archives, stamped, classified. The first public mention of her story appeared in 1959, in a brief press article about a mysterious German submarine carrying secret cargo. But the details were still missing. Only in the 1,970 seconds, when some wartime documents were declassified, did historians gain access to partial records. These fragments confirmed that the mission had indeed been a joint German-Japanese project, an attempt to transfer technology and materials that could help Japan develop new types of weapons. The collapse of the Reich had halted the plan before it reached its destination. Interest in U-234 resurfaced in Germany at the end of the 20th century. Naval historians published files from the Kriegsmarine archives, confirming that Operation East had been organized under the supervision of High Command. The documents painted a picture of desperate pragmatism, of a regime seeking salvation through science, even as it faced inevitable destruction. Over time, U-234 became more than a footnote in history. She came to symbolize a turning point, the moment when technology crossed the threshold from invention to annihilation. Her voyage reflected both the despair of a dying empire and the birth of a new order defined by nuclear power and fear. By the dawn of the 21st century, the submarine's story had been told in documentaries, research papers, and history books. To some, she represented the madness of a regime willing to gamble on science as salvation. To others, she was a cautionary tale, proof that knowledge, once created, can never truly be controlled. In the end, U-234 stood as a silent witness to humanity's most dangerous ambition. One voyage, conceived in secrecy and born of desperation, had become part of a greater narrative, the story of how the pursuit of power forever changed the course of human history. The story of U-234 did not end in the ocean. It lived on in archives, books, and documentaries, a reminder of how science and war once converged at a single, irreversible moment in history. The submarine's journey from the docks of Kiel to the coast of America became a symbol of transition, the passing of an old world consumed by war into a new one, shaped by atomic power. In the years that followed, humanity came to understand that scientific discovery could no longer be separated from politics or morality. The secret cargo of U-234 became a symbol of that realization. Even as Germany lay in ruins, its engineers had believed that technology might still win the war. The submarine carried that belief across the ocean and delivered it, instead, into the hands of a rising superpower. The American atomic program, already nearing completion, absorbed every detail gleaned from the captured materials. Whether or not the uranium from U-234 was directly used in the Manhattan Project, its symbolic significance was undeniable. The submarine embodied a transfer of power, the moment when the knowledge of a defeated empire helped define the new age of dominance. In the decades that followed, the atom became more than a weapon. It became a metaphor for the modern world, immense potential, bound to the perpetual fear of its own destruction. U-234, once a vessel of war, became a historical artifact of that paradox. Her mission, intended as a lifeline between two doomed allies, instead bridged the gap between eras. For the men who had served aboard her, the end of the war was not liberation, but silence. Many lived the rest of their lives in obscurity, avoiding questions about those final weeks at sea. A few spoke later in interviews, describing the unease of realizing that their loyalty, their discipline, and their survival had all been tied to a cause that no longer existed. In the United States, the classified files on U-234 continued to intrigue historians and journalists. Declassified reports in the latter half of the 20th century revealed just how closely American intelligence had monitored every detail of the submarine's arrival. Engineers studied her design, scientists examined her cargo, and analysts debated what it meant that the Reich had come so close to understanding nuclear power. The submarine's appearance off the American coast carried profound symbolism. Germany, which had once sought to dominate the world, now delivered its final secrets to the new global leader. The United States gained not only physical materials but also a glimpse into the future, a future in which scientific supremacy would define global order. As the decades passed, U-234 became a story retold in books, museums, and films. For some, she remained a relic of desperation. For others, a warning about the limitless ambitions of mankind. Her mission, interrupted midway, reminded the world that even the most guarded secrets eventually surface. Today, photographs remain black and white images of a submarine moored at Portsmouth, her crew standing silently on deck. The steel hull reflects the sunlight, indifferent to the enormity of the history it carried. Beneath that calm exterior lies the echo of deep water, the echo of secrecy, ambition, and the dawn of an age where a single discovery could change everything. U-234 sank not in battle, but into history itself, carrying a cargo heavier than any weapon, the weight of human knowledge and its consequences. That was her true legacy. And perhaps that is the lasting lesson she left behind, that nothing created by human hands ever disappears. It resurfaces, transformed, reshaping the world just as her final voyage reshaped the course of the 20th century.